Hi everyone, Steve here again. We're going to be talking a little bit more about S4 and of course how it interacts with the Ariba network. Last time we looked at this in a bit of detail around the actual processes. This time we're going to concentrate on the network side instead and see what the differences are between an EDI network and Ariba and why it's important to us. So just to recap on last time, obviously we've got our digital core and we have our edge environments such as Fieldglass, SuccessFactors for our workforce management. We've got our customer experience being obviously SAP Hybris, so I'm standing in the way there. And obviously we've got Leonardo for the external resources and our networks being obviously Ariba, which we're going to talk about a little bit more about today. Again, when we look at Ariba, we need to understand that there's a lot of different elements to it, all the way from sourcing, all the way to contracts. But today, again, we're going to talk about the network a little bit more. So actually, what's the network actually doing? Now, if we cast our minds back to the previous session when we talked about how does all these different elements work together, just a quick recap on that, of course, S4 being our system of record, our operational system. We want our caveman to be successful. He needs to be fit and healthy and be able to do all these good things. And obviously, with his decision making, he needs a good brain. He needs to be able to plan, to do what if planning and all those types of things. And that's where SAP IBP comes in. And to look at resources and threats and things like that out there and actually get insights, vision, and detection. That's where SAP Leonardo comes in. But finally, when we're talking about dealing with collaboration, dealing with our vendors, new ideas, dealing with actual operational stuff, it needs collaboration, the network out there, and that's where SAP Ariba comes in. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that network side of it to start us off. So just to reiterate again, obviously there are lots of processes from the operational side from S4 to Ariba and back again, but what we're going to talk a little bit more about this time is really this idea of the supplier collaboration you can see happening and how that actually works. You'll notice that a lot of our processes use the network for this supplier collaboration side, and that's really what we're going to look at a bit more today. So to start us off, I'm actually going to use the whiteboard to explain some of this. And when we look at traditional processes, quite often we look at EDI and we say, what's the difference between EDI and using a network? I'm just going to explain a little bit about that to start us off with. So if we take, for instance, a traditional methodology of looking at this, we could actually take many, many vendors. So let's draw some vendors on here. And of course, we may have our actual selves being the buyer side or the company that we're actually working for. And traditionally what we would do is we would build some middleware from our own system, our back-end system, going to all our vendors. And our vendors will also have middleware here as well, so they can receive the message and take that in. So we've got lots of middlewares happening, messages going backwards and forwards. And if we're just doing a one-to-one relationship, that's not too bad. But what if we want to do multiple relationships where this vendor is actually talking to this vendor and transacting with them? Again, we need new messages. So we need messages going backwards and forwards here. We also need messages going in here. If this guy is talking to this guy, we need a new message here, a link there. This guy is talking to this guy, we need new messages. And as you can start to see, as these vendors and customers start to interact, what we end up with is essentially spaghetti and very difficult to manage and to organize. A lot of work goes into it, a lot of cost to your organization. So what we look at instead of doing that is the actual Ariba network itself. Let me explain how that works. So to start off with, let me just draw the Ariba network here. Try and do it a little bigger, you can see on the whiteboard there. And obviously let's just call that the Ariba network. Now, let's take an example of a customer, and we'll call this customer PaintCo. So PaintCo have invested quite heavily over the years in some of their technologies, and they want to work better with their vendors. So we have our different types of vendors. Let's say we've got a construction type of vendor. They're doing some major construction works and things like that. For PaintCo, we may have a kind of a normal stationary type vendor. We could have some services coming in here. We could have even smaller vendors, such as I call them mum and pop type teams, your very small vendors that don't have IT services. And also, when we talk about, because it's a paint company in this case, I'm going to put in a chemicals company here, a big one that actually has lots and lots of the raw materials that PaintCo require to actually do their core business and actually work with them. So the difference here between the EDI functionality is each of these vendors connects to the network like so. And of course, Paintco will also connect to the network. And the great thing about this is we can actually see now a much simpler way of actually transacting B2B business. But another major difference here is also that the Ariba network is actually a document repository. And that document repository allows us to have all these different message types, such as purchase orders, ASNs, invoices, goods receipt, all those different areas actually in here, and we can report on this, we can check it, we can see what's going on inside the actual network itself. But to add to that as well, and this is a very important point, we have our business rules. And what our business rules do is they essentially work with all those different document types to ensure that the processes are followed correctly from both sides, from the vendor all the way through to, in this case, Paintco. Let me explain that a little further. Let's take a standard process that we may have. So we have a purchase order going out. That might require an advanced shipping notification. It may also require some goods receipt to occur from Paintco. And finally, of course, we've got some invoicing happening as well. Pretty standard type of process. What the business rules allow us to do is to control how the process actually works inside the Ariba network itself. For instance, we can set rules such as do not allow the invoice to be passed through from the vendor until the goods receipt has occurred. That way, we know that the goods receipt is good, the invoice is good. Other types of rules. Do not allow the goods receipt to happen until the actual ASN has been sent to us. Therefore, we can control how that happens and go through the processes. And there are many, many of these business rules. There are 80 plus business rules controlling how these different processes work. And that's what we're going to look at a little bit later on. I'm going to show you the system and how you can actually see those business rules. However, back to our idea of a network versus this EDI movement. Things get a little bit more interesting when we start to talk about how does a vendor communicate with its customers. So if we look at our whiteboard again, obviously we've got our vendors going through the system, but how do they actually communicate? There are many different ways in which they can communicate. Some of them may be using things like EDI to communicate to the network. Some of them might be using just normal messaging, straight direct there. Also, we have the ability to do things like, for your smaller players, email inside the network as well. And what that means is with our light accounts, we can simply send our smaller mum and pop type teams and things like that who don't have a big system in the back end. We can send them an email, they can click on a link and they can go into the system and do things. It allows them to do things like messaging, confirmations and all that kind of stuff actually on the network without having any other system apart from an email and a link to a browser. Great stuff. Where it's also important is our big raw materials and direct materials here. So for instance, this chemicals company, because they are direct materials, are used in our actual processes from our Paintco. It's really important to Paintco that we collaborate correctly with these guys. So what we can do is we can actually send a forecast and other types of information to Paintco, from Paintco to our chemical company to allow them to actually see what's going on and get visibility of that forecast in the system. Some great types of messaging going through the actual network. Now, when it gets a little bit more interesting is obviously Paintco are the customer here in this particular case. But let's flip that on the head a little bit. What happens if our construction company here need to buy some paint for construction? Well, suddenly, as well as being a vendor, of course, they are also now a customer. Do they need to create all their new EDI messages and everything else through to Paintco to buy from them? No. What they can do now is they're connected to the network, Paintco are connected to the network, and we can start messaging that way once the messages are set up. So we're not having to rebuild everything from scratch. And this starts to happen as well. So let's say that our chemical company requires some paints, or our stationery company want to have some fillers and glues and things like that. Then obviously these guys are all talking to each other backwards and forwards through the network. So the messages going backwards and forwards in here, as opposed to setting up that spaghetti network that we had earlier. So really interesting. It starts to show how the network really is an actual network as such. Okay, just going to grab a seat here for a moment so I can show you the system. Apologies, just move the camera a little so you can see me a little easier. Okay, good stuff. Now we understand what the differences are between the network and the actual system itself. Let's go and take a look at it. So here I have SAP Ariba, and we can see I'm currently looking at my inbox. I've got all my messages coming through for invoices and things like that. And we showed in the previous video how we can actually go through a process flow, one system to another, and actually see them happening. All good stuff. But what I want to show you now is a little bit more under the covers and actually show the business rules for the network. It's really important for us to understand this is the policeman, if you like, within the actual system itself. So when I go into the configuration side, obviously I can set basic settings around my company, all those types of things. But if I go down to my default transaction rules, this is where I can actually see the rules that are controlling how the messages flow through the network. So to start off with, we can see I've got blanket purchase order rules, I've got schedule agreement rules. Coming down a little bit, I've got advanced shipping notification rules, and so on and so on. As you can see, there are quite a lot of these. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but let's have a look at some of the interesting areas we can talk about here. So invoicing rules, for instance, require the suppliers to create a ship notification for the purchase order before creating an invoice. And what that does is actually controls the process for the vendors themselves. They can't send us an invoice unless the ship notification has happened. And the rules go on and on and on. As you can see, there's quite a lot of these in here. Now, the great thing about that is it controls the process. So when the invoice hits your system, you know it's been goods receipted, it's done the three-way match, so obviously when it hits your ERP system, things are working properly. It also ensures through the network that messages don't just hit your system and then are actually incorrect. So lots of advantages around that. But it doesn't just stop there. Let's say we have different types of vendors, and we talked a few moments ago about our different types of vendors in the system. We don't want all those vendors to be set up in the same way. We may have different rules for our smaller vendors than we do for our big vendors. So what I can do here is go into my actual suppliers, and if I go to my supplier groups, I can look at my different groups of vendors. So for instance, I may have my direct vendors, my supply chain vendors, and I can click in there. And what I can see here is I've actually got a supplier group transaction rules. So these are my business rules for that particular group of vendors. And if I click on that, here I can see again all of the rules that I had before, but I can change them and make them quite specific. So things like under delivery allowed and all those different elements, and we can show some more information on this if you want to go to online help. There's lots and lots of different rules there, but we can set them specifically for this group of vendors, which allows us to control how the messaging happens between those vendors and our organization. So that was just a very, very quick demonstration. I don't want to save that. Demonstration on the different rules there in the system, obviously controlling how these messages are going backwards and forwards, all the way through from requisitioning, purchase orders, so on and so forth. So just to finish off, obviously we've touched a little bit on the actual network itself. But again, those different messaging types that we have in the system, it's not all just about purchase orders. We have, of course, our forecast demand and commit going through. We've got our purchase orders, obviously, for purchase order confirmation, advanced shipping notification, so on and so forth. We have our schedule agreements. We have a component inventory. This is for things like contract manufacturing, consignment inventory, quality notifications. All those types of things are also included in the network when we talk about our supply chain collaboration for those direct materials. So thank you very much. Just wanted to quickly talk a little bit more about the network there. Of course, when we talk about Ariba, we talk about a single source of truth, a simple and easy to use user experience, and you saw that there. I was changing those business rules. It's nice and straightforward. And of course, the supplier network allowing us to all work together rather than having lots of point-to-point solutions. Thank you very much for your time.